You're a places where history doesn't just fade, it's deliberately erased, where the victors of war made deals that condemned millions, and then buried the evidence so deep that even the screams couldn't reach the surface. This is the story of a betrayal so complete that entire populations vanished between one border and the next, sent back to die by the very nations that claimed to fight for freedom. February 1945, the Crimean resort town of Yalta. 3 men sit in a room that will determine the fate of the post-war world. Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. They're dividing Europe like a chessboard, redrawing borders, deciding who lives under what flag. But there's another agreement being made in the shadows of these grand negotiations, one that history would rather forget. It's about people, millions of them. Soviet citizens who fled westward during the war, who surrendered to Allied forces, who believed they'd found sanctuary. The Western Allies promised Stalin something extraordinary. They will send them all back, every single one, no exceptions, no questions asked. They called it repatriation. The word sounds almost gentle, like going home. But for those who would be forced onto trains heading east, it was a death sentence wrapped in diplomatic language. Imagine you're a Soviet soldier, captured by the Germans in 1941 during the catastrophic early months of the war. You survived the Wehrmacht camps somehow, skeletal sick, barely human. Then the Americans arrive in 1945. Liberation. You're saved. But when you tell them you're from the Soviet Union, everything changes. The smiles fade. They separate you from the others. You don't understand yet, but you're not being freed. You're being processed for return. And you know what awaits you there. Stalin had already made it clear. Any Soviet soldier who surrendered was a traitor. Capture meant you didn't fight hard enough, didn't love the motherland enough, didn't die when you should have. Order 227, not one step back, declared that Soviet troops who allowed themselves to be captured would be considered deserters. Their families would lose state rations. Their names would be erased. And if they survived the war, they would face the NKVD, the secret police, the filtration camps, the gulags, or execution. The Western Allies knew this. They knew what they were sending people back to, and they did it anyway. It started in occupied Germany and Austria, where millions of displaced persons crowded into camps administered by British and American forces. Among them, former Soviet POWs, forced laborers who'd been dragged to Germany to work in factories, Cossacks who'd fought alongside the Germans, refugees who fled during the Soviet advance, entire families who'd escaped westward hoping never to return. They begged the Allied soldiers not to send them back. Some showed the scars of NKVD torture from before the war. Others simply wept. Many knew exactly what awaited them, and they were right. The British were particularly efficient. In Austria, they rounded up Cossack units who'd surrendered to them, along with their families, women, children, the elderly. They were told they were being moved to Italy, somewhere safe. Instead, they were loaded onto trains and delivered directly to Soviet forces. When the Cossacks realized what was happening, some jumped from the moving trains. Others slit their throats. Mothers threw their children into rivers, preferring to drown them than let them face what was coming. At one camp in Austria, British soldiers used rifle butts and bayonets to force prisoners onto trucks. The official reports are clinical, detached. They describe incidents of resistance and necessary force. They don't describe the suicides, the families torn apart, the screams that echoed for hours after the trucks drove away. The Americans were no different. At camps across their occupation zone, Soviet citizens were classified, cataloged, and prepared for return. Some tried to resist, claiming they were Polish, or Baltic, or anything but Soviet. It rarely worked. The agreements at Yalta were clear. If you were a Soviet citizen as of September 1939, you were going back. Period. No asylum, no exceptions, no mercy. Why did the Allies do this? Why did Churchill and Roosevelt, champions of freedom and democracy, agree to send millions of people to certain death or imprisonment? The answer is as cold as it is simple. They needed Stalin. The war in the Pacific was still raging. The Soviets had promised to enter the fight against Japan. More importantly, the Allies wanted their own prisoners back. Thousands of British and American POWs had been liberated by Soviet forces advancing through Eastern Europe. Stalin made it clear, if you want your men back, you give me mine. And so the deal was made. Human beings as currency, lives as bargaining chips. Between 1944 and 1947, approximately 2 million Soviet citizens were forcibly repatriated by Western Allied forces. 2 million. The numbers are so vast they become abstract, meaningless. But each one was a person. Each one had a name. Each one knew fear in those final moments, being pushed onto trains, watching the West disappear behind them, heading toward the Soviet border and whatever waited beyond. What did wait for them? The lucky ones, if you can call them that, were sent directly to the gulags. 25 years of hard labor was standard for former POWs. They built roads through frozen tundra, mined uranium with their bare hands, logged timber in forests where winter lasted 9 months. They died by the thousands from cold, starvation, exhaustion, but at least they lived for a while. Others went to filtration camps, sprawling detention centers where the NKVD interrogated returned prisoners to determine their loyalty. The questions were designed to trap you. Why did you surrender? What did you tell the Germans? Did you collaborate? There were no right answers. Admitting weakness meant you were a coward. Denying collaboration meant you were lying. The interrogations could last months. Many who entered these camps never left them. They simply disappeared into the vast network of prisons and labor camps that stretched across 11 time zones. Some were executed immediately, shot in the back of the head in the forest near the border, dumped into unmarked graves. Their families received no notification, no death certificate, just silence. And in the Soviet Union, silence meant you stopped asking questions. The cruelty extended even to those who'd fought for the Allies. The Soviets who'd been liberated from German camps, who'd thought they were going home as survivors, found themselves branded as traitors the moment they crossed the border. Their suffering under the Nazis meant nothing. What mattered to Stalin was that they'd allowed themselves to be captured, and that was unforgivable. There were suicides at every stage. On the trains heading east, people threw themselves through windows. At the border crossings, they tried to run and were shot. In the filtration camps, they hanged themselves from rafters rather than face another interrogation. The Western soldiers who carried out the repatriations witnessed this. They wrote about it in letters home. Some requested transfers because they couldn't bear to continue. But the operations continued anyway, because orders were orders, and the agreements had been signed. For decades, this history was classified, buried, hidden behind the excuse of wartime necessity. The British didn't fully acknowledge what happened until the 1980s when historians finally gained access to the archives. The Americans were equally silent. It was embarrassing. How do you explain to a public that believes in freedom and democracy that you forcibly returned millions of people to a regime you knew would imprison or kill them? How do you justify that? The survivors, those who somehow lived through the gulags and eventually were released, carried this story in silence for the rest of their lives. In the Soviet Union, you didn't talk about being a prisoner of war. You didn't talk about being repatriated. These things made you suspicious, unreliable, a potential enemy of the state. So they buried their memories, told their children nothing, and died with secrets that weighed more than all the years they'd survived. Some of the soldiers who carried out the repatriation spoke about it later in life. One British officer described how he'd had to order his men to use force against women clutching children, how he'd watched families being torn apart, how he'd known, absolutely known, that he was sending them to their deaths. He said he still heard their screams 50 years later. He said he'd been following orders. He said it didn't matter. He said he'd never forgiven himself. This is what Yalta really meant. Not just the division of Europe into spheres of influence, not just the beginning of the Cold War, but a betrayal so profound that millions of people learned in the most terrible way possible that the side you're on doesn't matter when great powers make deals. That freedom is conditional. That sanctuary can be revoked with a signature on a piece of paper. The camps where these people died, the filtration centers where they were interrogated, the forests where they were executed, most of them are gone now, reclaimed by time and trees, no markers, no memorials. The Soviet Union tried to erase them, and in many ways, it succeeded. But the questions remain. How do we remember a crime when both perpetrators and victims are gone? How do we honor the dead when we don't even know their names? How do we reckon with the fact that the nations that claim to fight for freedom actively participated in one of the great forced migrations and mass deaths of the 20th century? The answer is uncomfortable. We mostly don't. This story exists at the margins of World War II history, a footnote, an unfortunate necessity, a regrettable but understandable decision made in the fog of war. But for the people on those trains, there was nothing foggy about it. They saw clearly. They understood perfectly. They knew they were being abandoned, and they were right. Yalta, 1945. 3 men in a room deciding the fate of millions, and millions of others, invisible, voiceless, powerless, learning that their lives were negotiable, that freedom depends on which side of a border you're standing on, that sometimes the people who liberate you are the same ones who send you back to die. The trains don't run anymore. The camps have crumbled. The files have been declassified and archived, but the question remains, echoing across the decades like the sound of those train wheels heading east. When nations choose what to remember, what happens to the ghosts of what they forgot?